sent me some amazing comments, and I just appreciate it so very much because it just means so much more than what you could possibly know. Total strangers embracing me and the message. And so I told you then that this channel is going to be dedicated to study. It's going to be dedicated to logic, reason. It's going to be dedicated to information, because there's a lot of people who are of African American descent that are Democrats and have no idea why. They're Democrats because their parents were Democrats and their grandparents were Democrats, and they have no idea as to how we all became that way or began to think the same way and vote the same way. And there's a question that has been rolling around in the minds of many people, and it's a question that has been posed to me. Why would any black person want to be a Republican? And so I think that's something, as far as a topic, we're going to tackle that today. And we're going to talk about it more in depth. And we're going to do so because the truth needs to come out. The truth needs to be known. History needs to be explored. History needs to be unpacked. History needs to be on display. History, because it's foundational. You can't really succeed at anything if you don't know the history of what it is that you are standing for. If you want to be successful in any type of movement, you need to know where that movement started, and what the mistakes were, and not to make those mistakes in the future. So for me, as an African American, I knew very little about the history of the Republican Party, other than it was the party of Lincoln. Outside of that, I really didn't know much about the party. So as I began to study, I learned that there were three factions. When the party was formed in 1854, there were three factions inside of the party, and they were known as the conservatives, and then the moderates, and then there were what's called the radical Republicans. Now, if you're like me, you'd never heard of a radical Republican. I had no idea that there were different sections or factions within the Republican Party at its formation. President Abraham Lincoln was a moderate, which means that his basic goal for the Civil War was to keep the Union intact. He wanted to bring the South back into the Union, and that was his primary goal. But the radicals' agenda was to end slavery at all costs immediately, to completely eradicate slavery and to bring about the freedom of the freed slaves, and to have them have the same level of equality that those who were born in this country as free Americans. And so they pushed forth the legislation in Congress that had to do with the emancipation. It had the legislation that had to do with the Confiscation Act of 1861. And if you're not familiar with what that act was, let me just go ahead and give you a little history of what the Confiscation Act of 1861 was, because it's very important for us to understand what was going on inside the Republican Party during the war. So, the Confiscation Act of 1861 was an act by Congress during the early months of the Civil War that permitted court proceedings for the confiscation of the property of the Confederate States, including slaves. So basically what that meant was the military could go in and confiscate the slaves that were being held by the Confederate States. And it was passed in 1861, and within a year of its passing, tens of thousands of slaves were freed in the South. Never heard that, though. In particular, General David Hunter, a white man, in 1862, freed the slaves. He freed slaves in Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina. He wrote an order and said, hey, you know what? I'm a general. I'm going in. I'm freeing them. We've never, we don't understand that there were some radical people inside of the Republican Party that did some radical things. And if you look at what's happening today, we got some radical people in particular our president, Donald J. Trump, doing some radical things, willing to risk it all to do some things for the African American. Just today, the president signed an executive order that has to do with land that African American soldiers fought on, acres of land, and for it to be preserved as a historical place where the colored troops would serve in the Civil War. And so we need to understand that the Republican Party is a party that pushed and pushed and pushed for, at the time and season that they were in, these weren't popular laws. These weren't popular ideas. These weren't popular issues. And people were enraged. The Southerners were enraged. The Dixiecrats were enraged by these radical Republicans. But guess what? If the radicals hadn't done what they did, I may not be sitting here. Some of the radical Republicans during that time, some of the names you may have never heard of, because some of them I've never heard of. And I was like, why is my history book not filled with the knowledge of who these radical Republicans were? And why haven't I been taught that? And why haven't generations been taught that people risked their lives and their political careers to push forth legislation that wasn't popular at the time? But they did it for the African American slave. They did it for the African Americans, for those who were in chains, who were in bondage, who couldn't speak for themselves. Kind of like today. So they were members of Congress, the Speaker of the House, Galusha Grow, the Ways and Means Committee leader, Thaddeus Stevens, and even Lincoln's cabinet had some radicals. The Secretary of the Treasury and the Secretary of War were considered radicals. And guess where their center was? The radical center was in New England. And look where New England is today. It's blue. It's a Democrat stronghold. But New England, back in the Civil War age, was the epicenter for the radical Republicans. So I say to you today, why should a black person be a Republican? Because it's time to take back the title, the radicals. The ones that are ready to push for it. The ones who are ready to just throw caution to the wind for the better of the republic. Because we're not a democracy, we're a republic. And work hand in hand with our brothers and sisters of other races and say, hey, we're going to take back this, what the Republican Party was supposed to be and what it started out to be was for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for all Americans.